Okay, so I'm trying to set things up for a pre-tape to the second week of B74, the body in literature and film. We'll be having an open class this coming Tuesday, January 18th. And we'll be, I believe it's scheduled 5:30 to 8, but we can run over if necessary, or if the interest is there. The technical window we have is 6 to 9, but I know you're also watching this tape and you're reading my notes and you're doing a lot of other things, so I'm not going to do some wall-to-wall 3-hour open class. However, I am willing to go longer than 90 minutes if that's working for everybody. So all this is me making it up as I go along, as we continue in this COVID thing. Speaking of which, B74, unlike my other two classes, A11 and B76, as you know, it was officially listed under Professor Flynn, but she wasn't able to do this, so I stepped in. But the names are still kind of confusing. So if that's not clear, I'm teaching it. It was originally assigned to Professor Flynn. But it also was originally assigned as to be in class. This was back in November maybe. And it's still listed, quote unquote, in class. Now, I've gotten every assurance I can think of that I have managed to make this class, I've redesigned this class so that it is completely online. The midterm and final will be online. The journals are, the prompts are obviously online. So I've been trying to make sure that there's a guarantee here that if the university pivots back to in class, we don't have to just knock down the house of cards yet again. With one caveat, the university is pushing back. So to reiterate, you will not have to come into a physical classroom for this class. I have a separate battle going on about whether or not I will have to show up in person for a classroom visit, classroom appearance. And if I do, it will also be taped, and then students are allowed to come, but I'm going to make sure that not coming does not disadvantage you. So I'm having a separate issue with them about this and about the way they're doing it. The university has gotten incredibly, in my mind, high-handed and rather unilateral in their panic about COVID. So they keep issuing these directives. This came up when I said, why don't we switch the registrar to declaring this an online class? And they said, well, no, we won't, because it's not. And I was like, well, we're not in class. And they're like, yeah, but it is in class. It's like, well, why would you stick to that? And the reason they'll stick is they want the ability to switch on a day's notice to in class. And then when students and profs complain, they'll say it was always listed as in class. Well, all we did was suspend the requirement for the professor for a month because COVID was raging, and now we are rescinding that, and professors are expected to teach these things that are listed as in class. This is a great example, by the way, of bodies, biopolitics, biopower. I mean, COVID is a virus. People who get it get sick. They get hospitalized, possibly. They go to ICU, possibly. They die, possibly. It's transmissible. COVID's intensely transmissible. It seems to be less virulent. I happen to be double vaxxed and boosted. That was my choice. There are plenty of people who have issues with that. Some aren't vaccinated at all. I always wear a mask. I don't complain. There are issues with that. So this whole issue, so we're talking about compliance, and I'll be getting further into this in this tape later, but how do you force people to comply to protocol and regimens that involve the body? And we're even as I teach this class, this is not, I'm not going to put this on the final one, but this is a full-on example of your body as a battleground. In this case, I'm not on the cover of Cosmo or Playboy, but my body, frankly, is a discourse battleground between, say, me under my attempts to do the best I can for students, the university's desire to exert control. So my body in this instance is a battleground. I don't totally know how that's going to play out yet. There's a lot of Kafkaesque absurdity to this. The university's position, if we do swing back to in-class, will be that I need to go, but you don't, which on the one hand, I don't begrudge you guys. So that theoretically, I could simply do what I'm doing right now in a classroom and not in my bedroom. And that will be hugely different. That will make a legal difference to the University of Toronto. In other words, they could penalize me for being in my bedroom and not in a classroom. And then, because the other thing they haven't worked out at all is if we go back to in class, they're like, and students will be vaccinated and masked. And I was like, okay, and how do we know that? Well, because we asked them to. And it's not like I distrust you guys, but then suddenly, in addition to teaching a class, I'm supposed to, because there's no other protocol that I know of, check your vaccination slips, to ask you to leave if you either don't have a mask or take it off. We would have the very artificial, I would be there in masks, you would be there in masks, and theoretically trying to have a discussion. So I want to get back to the class. I've tried to make that clear to everybody, because the other kind of unfair issue that comes up when you resist compliance is that you get defined as the problem. I don't think I'm the problem, but I'm being viewed as a problem. And for the woman, and certainly for Eve White in the Three Faces of Eve, she's persistently defined in multiple ways. No wonder she has multiple personality. She's expected to be multiple things to shore up an unstable, contradictory, hegemonic discourse of the psychiatrist as master. And we already saw that in Dora. Just trying to, this light's kind of harsh. Let's try that. And so on very practical level, all I've said to you guys is I'm teaching this as an online class, start to finish, from now until you see your final grade on Rosie. I think I can stick to that. There are ways of evading their insistence that the final exam be in person, because I'm posting it as a 4-day window within which you choose your time. It evades the strictures of a sit-down final. Were I to try and do a timed final, 3 hours, they would demand, if they switch back to in-class, they would demand that all of you guys get in the same room for 3 hours. So we're not going to do that. I'm not going to do that. And none of this means I don't want to go back to the classroom, which is something that's been presented to me by, oddly enough, by numerous people, even though I've been doing this for 30 years in the classroom. Like, you're not going to get away with not wanting to go back to the classroom, Professor Leonard. Who's trying to get away with it and trying to do what's right for the students or myself? Anyway, you can tell I'm a bit annoyed, and I won't rant on about this, except I don't think I've wasted your time. I think what I've just said is the most incredibly current example I could possibly find. Those of you who've had my classes before know that I'm always have my antenna up for what makes what we're talking about relevant. So I can be talking about Dorian Gray from 1895 and bring in something about Facebook, and I do that all the time. So this isn't any different. It's just even more personal, because it involves me, the current university, you, the current class, the structure, the fact of a pandemic, and so on. Because I think the other thing that's, and let me again notice how cookie cutter hegemonic discourse can be. And many of you notice that with your Playboy Cosmo covers. It's a cookie cutter. It comes down and it cuts the body into a certain shape. And then it pastes discourse all around the body to legitimate that shape and not some other, and to insist both that the body emerges according to the discourse that surrounds it, but also can emerge as something else. And once emerged, cannot sustain cultural legibility without continuing to adhere to the protocol that allowed it to emerge in the first place. So that's what I mean by cookie cutter. You take your little Christmas cookies, you have a Christmas tree cookie cutter, you press down, it's now the shape of a Christmas tree. It can't decide, if cookies could think, halfway through baking that it wants to be, a reindeer. It can want that, it can think that, it can even act in its own mind like that, but it's going to look like a Christmas tree. It's going to be judged as a Christmas tree. And if it expects anybody to respond to it as a reindeer, it will be confused. And then if it insists that it's a reindeer and not a Christmas tree, if it insists that I think I'm this as a woman and not that, it will be seen as having mental health issues. How could you not think you're a Christmas tree? You look like a Christmas tree. You can't look like anything else. So you must be that. And so what we're seeing on the simplest level with Eve and the poems we look at in Plaster, also you see the rigidity or the applicant, images of rigidity, of cookie cutter, of plaster that goes on a cast initially soft and then it hardens into something that won't move. So part of what happens is to switch my metaphors. Another way, forget cookie cutters now, think about clay, soft clay that hardens into rock. I have several Barbara Kruger, we've already seen Your Body as a Battleground. But what happens when the legibility of your body is allowed to emerge out of the clay of everything your body could or couldn't be, but then that clay is allowed to harden? And that would be another example of the Cosmo and the Playboy shoot. It was really interesting to see Emma Chamberlain, if I have her name right, the YouTube star, who taped, so you get to see something of the photo shoot. You're watching her allow, and what's different, of course, is we get the tape of her apart from what the cover does. So it's really kind of a fascinating approach, because she insists on her, I think correctly, on her mutability, that she's a lot of people. She's someone who hasn't had her coffee yet. She's someone who finally got her coffee. She's tired. She's appreciative. She's got makeup on. She's got makeup off. We see all this stuff, and it's this kaleidoscope of mutability. Eventually, there's a Cosmo shot, a cover, and not everyone's going to go see this tape. So she still submits, kind of like Harrison Ford and that Star Wars thing where he gets turned into carbonite, to a frozen form. But what are the things that what this sort of things can harden the outlines of your body? And one of them clearly is the male gaze. So the expectations of the man. There's so much interesting gaze architecture, in Three Faces of Eve. And I'll be talking about some of that. And if I can figure out how to share my screen, I'll show you some today, but I'll certainly go to something. I'll hold up some stills in the upcoming open class. Let me just mention this, since you may have already seen the film, or you will between now and Tuesday. Who's sitting where? I mean, watch. Eve White never gets near the chair that Dr. Luther occupies, whereas Eve Black not only sits in the chair, she lounges back and she plays with the letter opener, which is not just a phallic symbol, but since it's meant to cut, the implication of a female castrator. And the effect of her taking over Dr. Luther's chair is he flees the room to go get reinforcements, to go get his male colleague across the hall so that two men can come in. And in a way, Eve Black persists. She is outside the mold, and she needs to be contained by their office. And we'll talk about containment strategies, but the whole issue of what is a cure, especially for a woman, in a psychoanalysis. And this is paralleled with Dora, clearly, where Freud thinks, well, one way out of this is accept on Herké's approaches, assume they're in good faith. I don't know why, based on what he's done. He keeps trying to defend that there was nothing vulgar about his approach. What is not vulgar about grabbing and kissing a married man, grabbing and kissing a 14-year-old girl, and then reasserting the proposition several years later and grooming her in between with flowers every day and gifts on a regular basis, including the jewel box that becomes a central feature in Dora's dreams. And Freud's not wrong when he sees the jewel box as female, as the female body. Almost fairly specifically the genitals, in the same way when he sees the little purse she brings in and she's putting the fingers in and out of the purse, he assumes that she's signaling that her issues with masturbation when she was a child. What seems much more likely is if you see Dora in the guy being Eve Black in that moment and not Eve White, she's saying, you men are a bunch of people sticking your fingers in and out of me, and fiddling around and deciding what it is you need, what it is you see, what it is you feel, and then telling me that that's what I need and that's what I see and that's what I feel. And it's like, get your fingers out of my purse. And when that's not possible, Freud cannot keep his theories out of trying to shape her body. He can't keep his fingers out of her purse. She says, this is our last day. We're done. And doesn't give him any quote unquote warning. Or does she? I mean, arguably, and Freud reluctantly moved to this conclusion, she has been warning him for weeks. I mean, it's about a 3-month procedure, and they met 2, 3, even 4 times a week sometimes. So there may have been, as I can't even do the math in my head right now, but there might have been 50 meetings, let's say. And she's been warning him, for at least 20, maybe 30. So the difference between saying she quit without warning and I refused to see anything she was doing as a warning, because I could recast that, bringing in the purse, as a warning. This is what it feels like to be in this office. This is what it feels like to be around Herr K, my father, even Mrs. K. It happened to my mother. She too got, and I hope this doesn't come off as too vulgar, but she too got fingered by her husband, who gave her syphilis, and Freud has no interest in her purse, and simply consigns her to being psychotic. Comes up with a term he doesn't even follow up on, and called housewife psychosis. Can't wait to just get her out of the picture. She's not in the picture, but she's in the picture. Dora warns Freud again, brings her mother into the picture by saying, by the way, I saw a painting of a mother and a child, and I stood before it for 2 hours. And somehow Freud's like, well, that can't be about the fact that I've refused to let your mother into the frame, into the office. So let's rearrange that somehow, and indicates that I saw the same picture, and gets more interested in what he thought it means than the way Dora has, if you will, brought it into the office. So Freud's office, like Luther's office, is like a cover of a magazine, in the sense that one way you control is what you allow in the office and what you don't. And here you can pay attention to the doors opening and closing, who comes in, who goes out, why does he leave. When Eve Black turns on the radio in the office, she shatters the sanctity of psychoanalytic theory and of the room, because this snappy jazz tune comes through, and she starts moving her body in rhythm to the music, possibly somewhat aware of being seductive to Luther, although one gets the feeling she's also just in the moment, enjoying her body. So she too is defying this entire apparatus of, it's my body, and I'll enjoy it any way I want, and not have that returned to me as a pathology. So, because clearly the split of Eve White and Eve Black is along the lines of the pleasure of the body. I mean, Eve White says no connection to her own body. She must have had some kind of sexual relations with her husband, or she wouldn't have had Bonnie, her child, but she seems to know almost nothing about it, except that the child emerged. And when you when you strip someone of any connection to their body's sensual capacities, you can set up a doppelganger, an alter ego, where you flip over to being nothing but a sensual, and by making it a switch, and we'll see this in Plaster, a poem I'll look at it in a minute. In making that an abrupt switch, it's possible for the one who's disconnected from the body to keep a distance from the experience of having fully indulged the body. This is a central feature of Plath's The Bell Jar, where the woman Esther follows her sexy friend Doreen to the apartment of a guy named Lenny, and Doreen clearly has a wild, alcohol-fueled one-night stand with this guy, and Esther lets herself out the door and goes home and washes it all off. But it's possible to see that Esther is also Doreen, but she lets Doreen be the sexy girl, and then she's Esther, and then she can reject Doreen after the fact. So Esther can go to Lenny's room, become Doreen in the sexual encounter, go back to being Esther, leave, take a shower, wash off Doreen, wash off Lenny, wash off whatever happened with Lenny. And we see that acted out in The Bell Jar. And I may post just that chapter. I know we don't have time to go over the whole book again. And it's a book I teach in A11, no less. I might send you guys the link to my taped lecture. In fact, I hadn't even thought of that. I taped a lecture on The Bell Jar for A11. Anyway, possibility. So one of the things, so we have to realize this thing of congealing the body. So here's another image by Barbara Kruger, and let me hold that up so you can see it. Your gaze hits the side of my face, and of course this woman has, if you will, been turned into stone. So you still have her voice, your gaze hits the side of my face. So you have the voice of, and Eve Black is in some ways the voice of a silenced voice of Eve White. Eve White barely has a voice. She really doesn't have a voice at all in terms of stating anything about herself. It's at best, it's a voice that says, yes, sir, no, sir, sorry. It's kind of all that it communicates to her husband, to Luther. Whereas Eve Black is overtly adversarial at all times. I'm not married to that guy. If I were married, it certainly wouldn't be to that lead bottom, as she called him at another point. But so the Cosmo is like the female body turned to stone, Playboy, female body turned to stone, and what is this gaze? It's pretty obvious. It's got to be the male gaze. So why does the myth of the Medusa, as you probably know, is a woman with snakes for hair. And if you see her as a man, you turn to stone. But there's a degree of projection in that myth that is actually much more the case, that when women encounter the male gaze, they turn to stone. It's men who are Medusas, not women. It's men fearing to endure what they in fact impose that creates that myth in the first place. And how is Medusa defeated? Pericles has a reflective shield. He gets her to look in the mirror, and then she is turned to stone because she sees her own reflection. There's a lot of mirrors in Plath's poetry, certainly, but also in Three Faces of Eve. One in particular, where she's in front of a mirror. Her husband has just finished castigating her for having, because he's heard stories that she's been out and about after she gets a rooming house of following one of her dismissals from the hospital, and then her head is down in that usual abject, collapsed condition, and then it comes up with her eyes are mischievous, and we see her grin, and then she's heading off to another roadside bar. So that's Eve Black refusing to be turned to stone by the reflection that the doctors are insisting she sees when they hold up their reflective mirror. Dora refuses to see herself in Freud's mirror. He keeps polishing it, framing it, and she looks at it and says, "That's not me." And he's like, "Yeah, but it is." And she's like, "But it isn't." "But it is." And then she's like, "Well, this is our last day. Tired of looking at your mirror," which is actually just a frame with nothing in it, in which your face, Freud's face, resides. It's like, I'm not going to turn myself into a stone image so that you can remain unaware of the degree to which you are using your theories to create what it is I should see when I look in the mirror, so that I will begin to self-police myself and be that thing. And once I do that, I have to I dissociate, and I move into at least dual personality, like Doreen and Esther. We know when you look deeper, the woman, two psychoanalysts wrote a book about a woman named Christine Sizemore, which they called Three Faces of Eve, which they published, and that was the book that was bought to produce the movie. And we have yet another male gaze, Alistair Cook, who stands in front of an empty screen and tries to prepare the audience to align themselves with the gaze of Dr. Luther from the outset, benevolently presenting the case that this poor troubled woman came and everyone's trying to help her somehow. Her husband, Luther's colleague, and so on. So even before this movie starts, very unusual, they break the fourth wall and insist it's a true story. But it doesn't even fully follow the book that Dr. Thigpen and Clackle, I think his name was, wrote, nor does it, much like Dora's case, this case did not end with that melodramatic, idyllic conclusion where everyone, the three, the new husband and Bonnie, somehow that transition was seamless. They all have ice cream cones. They're all, and it looks like a car commercial. And then even more so when they shoot the car from the back, hold the camera steady so the car is allowed to drive off into this new future, all because Eve White and Eve Black both died and were reborn as Jane, the woman who initially emerges as sort of reasonable, but also having zero memory. Seems to be aware of Eve White and Eve Black. So the third personality in the Three Faces of Eve is immediately seized on by Luther as this is the personality that adjusts. This is the personality that will be able to masquerade as womanly. That's the other thing we have on the table this week. Womanliness is Masquerade by Joan Rivera, where she says you might be, famously at that one point in that essay, she says you might be asking, what is the relation, what is the difference between a woman and her masquerade as a woman? And my whole point, Rivera says, is there is no difference. Yes, there's female anatomy, but what we call a woman, what makes it possible for a woman to be culturally legible, is an effective masquerade. To the degree to which the woman self-consciously masquerades is clearly at issue, and that Rivera's essay, and there's some evidence that it's possible Rivera, at least in the case of the university professor, is describing herself that she talks about how there's this woman who's a university professor. Rivera taught seminars, who often is standing in a room full of men. She mentions that the woman's in a field that's dominated by men, trying to presenting findings that both endorse and contradict the findings of these men in the room. But since she's not a man, she gets very nervous both before the talk and after, that she has brandished the letter opener. She has brandished the phallus, and that creates so much anxiety that she becomes very coquettish, quote unquote, this was Rivera's word. And even in presenting the paper, will wear hyper feminine clothing and will quickly look to flirt with the most possible likely father figure in the room, all in this desperate attempt of please don't punish me. Yes, I grabbed the letter opener, but sorry, and I'll give it back. But what's so devastating about a woman who takes on the position of the phallus is it makes it clear how the phallus actually isn't attached to anything. It creates castration anxiety in men that's really related not to whether their actual anatomy is cut, but more they feel cut off from their patriarchal symbolic positions. Because if a woman has a phallus and women don't anatomically have penises, then having a penis is not the same as having a phallus. The phallus is simply using a piece of male anatomy as a metaphor to enforce the superiority of one gender over another. And you can't have, but that's why I love that scene with the letter opener. It's like the phallus has disconnected from both doctors and is floating on the room, and she's playfully holding it. And they're kind of holding it together, but they're also, they have an assent, they've been castrated. There's something about her that has escaped their theories, their discourse. And they're now really, why does he run out of the room to get his colleagues? He's basically saying there's a breach. There's a breach in our containment strategy that makes patriarchal look like a normal thing, like the only thing, like the best thing. And right, it's like Eve Black is a nuclear plant that has breached, and he runs out because he's like, I have a breach. So far, it's contained inside my room. The same thing when there's a problem with a nuclear factory, nuclear plant. The immediate concern is, okay, this is bad, and this plant's probably toast. But we have all this stuff to make sure it just stays in the plant. Will it keep it out of the water, keep it out of the air? And there's a panic there of, I have a rupture in the woman as masquerade discourse upon which our own hegemonic discourse and our position as patriarchal phallic masters depends. And either we figure out how to contain this and clean it up in my office, or or it could contaminate. It could get out of the office. Arguably, the beginning of what's called the second wave feminist movement, the first wave being women getting the vote in the early part of the century, the second wave, 1963-64, publication of Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique. It got out of the room. That book was explosive. It blew open the door. And all these issues of how to keep housewives contained and happy, and that it was only the more recalcitrant, impossible women that needed to be medicated or outright drugged or institutionalized or submitted to shock therapy, and various other forms of punishment that were framed as benevolent therapeutic interventions. Which is why you also have to keep your eye on, how does a therapy define cure? Because that's the cookie cutter problem. No therapy is any better than its self-awareness of what it's trying to accomplish. And if what it's trying to accomplish is to get a woman who's unhappy at her masquerade and is floundering, if the idea is to persuade her that, it basically gaslight her to go back to the masquerade, shore her up with pills or reassurance or therapy or whatever has to happen, but get her back to performing the masquerade. In that sense, women in institutions, especially in the 50s, were essentially off stage. And Plath records this in The Bell Jar too. And Sexton, another great poet who was institutionalized on a regular basis throughout the 50s, tongue in cheek somewhat, she referred to the institution as the hotel. It's where she went when she was exhausted and couldn't put on another performance. But the implication always was, you can rest at the institution. In fact, you can stay here the rest of your life. You can only leave. Sounds like Hotel California, not entirely inappropriate. You can only leave if you can demonstrate to the faculty and staff here that you've pulled it together enough to resume the masquerade. And that's the famous ending of The Bell Jar, where she's much more worried about how she's dressed. And she's clearly re-entering the masquerade, and she knows that's the only way out. And she's accepted that. I got to get out of this institution. I have to pirouette for this room full of men. And they have to judge that my pirouette is adequate. And then they'll let me go. And I guess I'll take my chances. But as she ends that novel, how do I know the bell jar won't descend again somewhere else, somewhere later? So here's an example from Kruger, as I just mentioned, that paralysis. And here is, what is this process of helping? This is from the 1950s, helping a woman. And I'll just put this up here for long enough, at least. Sorry. For you to read it, and I'm going to read it for you, but there's 4 boxes. In one case, she sees a psychiatrist. One can look like Luther and Eve. And then she's taking a pill, and she's taking a pill again, and she's taking a pill again. And the last 2 boxes, she is taking a pill again, taking a pill again. Every one of these photos, which I think you now have on tape, can be compared to a Cosmo or Playboy magazine. I mean, they don't look like, but they're all cookie cutter images that naturalize what do you do with the nervous breakdown of a housewife. And the starting point is we're not going to critique even though this says, and I'll read the first part of it, although you can read it if you just pause and go back. In the first square, the physician listens to a tense, nervous patient discuss her emotional problems. To help her, he prescribes myrpresan, 400 milligrams, the only continuous release form of meprobamate. And that's that first square. So hold up. So the word choice here is obviously very important to help her. She's tense and nervous. She discusses her emotional problems. Notice it doesn't say they discuss them or that they're given any legibility or credibility. It doesn't matter what they are. Women come in and complain. The only point of the complaint is to say, here's a woman whose masquerade as a woman is failing. How do I get her back? Now, I can't, if I just send her out of the office with nothing, she will have a nervous breakdown. She'll be crying in the middle of the grocery store or somewhere else. And that will also decontaminate the environment, the surroundings. So in the second box, the patient takes 1 myrpresan 400 capsule at breakfast. She has been suffering from recurring states of anxiety, which have no organic etiology. That's devastating because that cuts you off from your own body. The woman gets cut off from her own body. There's no reason why you feel like you do. Nonetheless, you clearly feel like you do. So let's raise your tolerance so you can feel the way you do and still function within the masquerade of womanliness. So in the third box, you actually have the woman in the grocery store looking at a can of I don't know what. So notice this seamless adjustment to get back to your function, your role. And it says, she stays calm while on myrpresan, even under the pressure of busy, crowded supermarket shopping. Who brought up shopping? Who brought up the supermarket? There's a strange attempt to be like, yeah, her environment is stressful, but it's her environment. We can't even question that. Who else does the shopping in the family? Anybody? And no one else is going to do the shopping. And if you don't, you're failing as a mother, you're failing as a wife, you're failing as a woman, you're failing, period. And you're breaking down under guilt and shame. So, we feel sorry for you. We're going to help you out. We're going to give you a tranquilizer so that the aspects of your impossible situation that are causing your body to break down. They go on and on about mental health. It's actually the body they're worried about. If you're too anxious to go shopping, people are going to notice. And that often inadvertently is the point of symptomatology here. Like even the father of Dora, he won't bring her to Freud or seriously listen to any of her actual complaints, like stop using me as a pawn so you can have an affair and right in front of my mother and me and so on, and then expect me to also see to Herké's required dispensations, whether that's an affair or some kind of sexual servicing so that he gets something out of leaving his wife to you. None of that matters. But when she faints, when she coughs all the time, when she leaves a note saying, I can't do this anymore, those other people will notice, other people will see. And that's why so much typically if a woman is has been convinced that to be a woman is to masquerade as a woman, and she's alarmed that she can't, it's hard for her to question, why is this the rule? And then they look for any help and they feel as it's a personal failing, like, what's wrong with me? Other women do this, I can't. So I'm sick, I need help, and then be grateful for any help that's given. What Friedan and the feminine mystique and the sexual revolution, if you will, of the 60s brought about was women stepping outside of the framing of what a woman was and saying, if that's what a woman was, I don't know, then you just have to figure out what I am. So by the time we get to Woodstock or some of these massive cultural events of 1969, or not wearing bras, which became this big thing, burning bras, like what's wrong with these women and what's the matter with bras? And notice how much that's about the body. That is the burning of the bra is really an attempt to burn the mirror, burn the frame that contains women into a single, self-harming position. In the next movie that we'll be seeing next week, and I guess I'm never sure what trigger warnings mean entirely, because everything in this class is triggering, and arguably education itself is triggering. Nonetheless, there's in the next movie that you'll be seeing called 13, there are two specific scenes of the teenage girl cutting, and I know that's an issue because you need a visceral response if that's something that's being struggled with. So okay, so a trigger warning, but also context, which is how I try and deal. Like, I don't want to just show you material that's upsetting for the hell of it. I also don't know how to teach you to challenge it if we don't show it. So, but although I'm perfectly fine with you skipping the whole movie, if there's personal issue, you can let me know. We'll work that out. I'm not trying to torture anybody here. But the context of cutting is and this is where it can get very confusing. Cutting seems unhealthy, and on a certain level, it's not great. Cutting yourself with a razor, it's hard to see that's a healthy act, but it's a rebellion. It's hard to see anorexia as healthy. In fact, they aren't healthy, but it's really women who are sabotaging their bodies in a desperate attempt to be visible as something other than the masquerade they're trapped in. And you'll see in 13 that the discovery of the mother of the scarring that indicates the cutting is presented in melodramatic fashion, and I mean melodrama seriously, not as trivial, as a turning point. The mother turns back to seeing her daughter. Almost, you get the feeling she hasn't seen her daughter since her daughter was 8. Like, she knows her daughter at 8. She doesn't know her daughter at 13. And her daughter feels invisible at 13. And how most of the attempts the mother makes to connect to the 13-year-old would have been appropriate when she was 8, whether it's the clothing or the things that she does. And the daughter keeps trying to say that. And clearly the mom is struggling because she's also single. She has a boyfriend. They have history. He's had drug problems. He's in the house. He's sort of living there. The girl's father is absent. Anyway, remember this when you move into week 3. But at the moment, we're in week 2. So finally, the last 2 squares, and we get, just to kind of read this in a moment, relaxed, alert, attentive. She's able to listen carefully to PTA proposals. What the hell? Grocery shopping and PTA. Who brought those up? They just slip them in as kind of the unalterable signposts of whether you're a healthy woman or not. Can you shop? Can you go to the PTA? And can you pay attention at the PTA? Because what the revolution in tranquilizers in the 50s, particularly with Milltown, is one of this pharmaceuticals, and then on to Valium, they were distinctly different than barbiturates. Barbiturates knocked you out pretty much. But benzodiazepines, and we'll be talking more about these, they do tranquilize without having you pass out. And so this was, with some reason, and I'm not anti-pharmaceutical, but when you supply pills instead of helping someone with the context that's making them sick, that's all you do. That's the problem. The problem is not the pills. The pills can be very well, if the pill is a support system, while you figure out who you are and what you need to do, I think it can serve a valid function. So let me be clear about that, whether it's antidepressants or any number. But then we have things like OxyContin, which clearly offered a pain relief. It was just so addictive that it quickly became worse than whatever it claimed to be trying to alleviate. And then finally, she is peacefully asleep. She rests undisturbed by nervousness or attention. So she's, perfect. Case closed. She went shopping. She went to the PTA. She paid attention. She fell asleep. Notice one of the unstated issues here, and most of these ads in the 50s were in medical journals, virtually all of them. The phenomenon of advertising directly to potential patients started happening in the 80s and the 90s, and that's going full bore right now. But the part of the pitch to doctors, many of them general physicians and not psychiatrists, is if you have someone showing up over and over again with stuff you don't know how to treat and they are exhausting you, this pill will help you, the doctor, because the patient won't come back. They'll be tranquilized. And it's amazing how often that's the pitch to the doctor. Do you have a nervous patient that doesn't take your advice? There's no direct reference to pharmaceuticals in the Three Faces of Eve, which to me seems a very, very conspicuous absence, because by 1957, Milltown was a tranquilizer that 1 in 20 people had either tried it or were subscribing, overwhelmingly women, 80%. So how do you make a movie like this? Nobody, like Milltown was not ever offered to Eve. That really boggles credibility. But in any event, we can imagine Dr. Luther opening a journal after one of his disruptions with Eve Black and seeing an ad like this one I've just walked you through, and there was a whole nother realm of pharmaceuticals, more in the amphetamine range, which also became hugely popular. They were advertised for weight control. They were advertised for giving you the pep you need to finish vacuuming the house. It was another route. So perhaps the lethargic Eve White would initially have been seen as a candidate for Ritalin and amphetamine to perk her up, but that might have unleashed an even more disruptive Eve Black. So who knows where that would have gone. And actually you have to look very closely. I'm going to show you another ad. And this is called Now She Can Cope. And so if you look at this ad, and then I'll read the fine print, for some of which I typed out. Sorry, I'm not trying to make you seasick. It's hard to hold this stuff steady. But you'll see a woman who's just been tied up by her boisterous child, and she's looking down and smiling and is being like, oh, kids are kids, which is also true. And that's the image you get of what this pill will allow. And noticing once again the framing of what a woman should be doing: getting married, having a child, raising that child, not breaking down under the pressure of it. That's just a given. Doesn't seem to ever be discussed. And then the fine print I'm reading from the ad: when stress is situational, environmental pressure, worry over illness, the treatment often calls for an anxiety allaying agent, which has a prompt and predictable calming action and is remarkably well tolerated. So notice we have the word situational and environmental, but it never goes farther. Patriarchal, capitalistic, role of mother-daughter, wife, lover. What's actually happening. We know the husband is such a cipher in All About Eve. He does seem abusive. Now, granted, we're shown where she runs for Eve, presumably Eve Black, although it's not clear exactly what iteration of Eve wraps the cord around Bonnie's neck. She certainly doesn't remember doing it. Eve Black never talks about it. Eve White says there's no way I did that, and I think that she believes that. But either no one asks Eve Black, so were you the one who tried to strangle a kid? It's left out, hanging out there. It's a kind of it's a shock scene for sure. And obviously the husband throws her to the floor. And again, that seems justifiable. There is a clear and imminent danger to the child. And then but then when it's over, he says, stay down, get up. If you get up, I'll kill you. Stay down. And we see her head sink to the rug again. At least twice, he said, I've got a good, 3 times perhaps, I've got a good mind to give you a slap. That's another place where you can see the nexus of body and discourse. And of course, domestic abuse. What has happened when you're having an argument with someone, and then the man, as is typically the case, slaps the woman in the face, punches the woman in the face? If the body isn't the thing that's the battlefield, how do you move from words to punch? And what's happened? There's a Medusa-like moment where the man feels like he's about to be turned to stone by the gaze of the woman, because typically the slap in abuse occurs when a woman is at her most defiant, and when she's, for whatever reason, has an Eve Black moment. So Eve Black is way more likely to get slapped than Eve White. So when Eve White blanks out and buys all the dresses as Eve Black, it's Eve Black he wants to beat up, but now she seems to be Eve White. And then somehow, while he's in there trying to pack up the dresses, she has another iteration. Now, one thing we know about Christine Sizemore, the woman that all this was based upon, is it was recorded she had up to 22 personalities. She wasn't cured at the end of this endeavor. She went on, it wasn't until another 20 years later that she herself felt that she had begun to get some kind of control over the matter. So there was no, beautiful drive down through the foliage of a lovely fall afternoon with her immediately reconstituted family, with the other husband gone. I mean, that switch out is really interesting. On one level, the movie doesn't suggest this at all, but couldn't this partly be a story of a woman who clearly was going to get better when she got divorced? She was, and they barely mention it. Like, there's just a scene between the 2 doctors where they're like, do you think the divorce upset her? No, I don't think that mattered at all. Seriously? And how much of this, because the pressure that if a marriage fails, or even if a man has an affair, again, the woman has failed, the wife has failed. You didn't set up a home they wanted to go to. You weren't sexually available in the proper way. You're like, no, we're not patting him on the back for going and finding this solace with some other woman, but you gave him no choice. And then they work on you. How can we make you sexier? How can we make you a better housewife so this guy will stay home? Why doesn't he stay home? Or get divorced or do something? Well, where's his responsibility? Where's his accountability? As usual, these tapes are getting a little longer than I would have preferred, but the splitting that I want to talk about, that one way to protest the freezing mechanisms, the Harrison Ford-like freezing mechanisms of dictates about what your body should be when you've lost the war with your body as a battleground. So one result is this, to pick another Kruger image. We have received orders not to move. And that certainly looks like Eve White in one of her typical collapses. And then there's Eve Black, who's like, screw that, in more ways than one, and I'm gonna move. And what are all these little needles that both monitor and limit movement? This is clinical discourse, patriarchal discourse, hegemonic discourse, until finally the woman is feels they're in a permanent crouched posture. And so how do you deal with that splitting? And what are the secondary gains of the splitting? This is where class is especially especially brilliant. As a young woman who was going to Smith College, very bright, straight A student, who had a well-meaning mother who continually tried to help her perform her masquerade as womanly. You get the feeling with Plath's mother that she knows it's a strain. It's a strain she's dealt with her whole life. And the issue is, how do you cope with it? It's like that ad for pharmaceutical. Now she can cope. Not really. I mean, she could cope, she wouldn't need the pharmaceutical. The pharmaceutical is coping, is allowing her to cope by chemically numbing down her perfectly correct and even adept analyses that she has been received orders not to move. So the poem in Plaster in particular, and this has all been posted, I shall never get out of this. There are two of me now. And this goes right back, obviously, to Eve Black and Eve White. The difference between this poem and the Eve Black, Eve White issue is Eve Black knows about Eve White. Eve White doesn't know about Eve Black. And that can remind us of the Esther Doreen split in the bell jar. Here in this poem, at least, the voice of the poet is animated by at least a temporary awareness of both of this. But what's the third term? The third term in Plaster is this love-hate affair with the props that allow you to be Doreen or to go back to being Esther. The lipsticks, the foundations, the taking baths, the soap, Cosmo, all the articles at Cosmo, everything that all of that implies. These are all props to help you tolerate a masquerade that can also quite literally be suffocating or paralyzing you. This new absolutely white person and the old yellow one. So this implication has been in all these ads I showed you too. What the woman patient is often shown an image when she walks into the office, and it's essentially like this is the absolutely white person. And I don't think the word white is completely unintended. We'll be talking more about that as we talk about the racialized body. And it comes up in Riviere in the strangest way, at least initially, that in an attempt to stabilize the masquerade, one of the women has this fantasy of leading on a Black man and then turning him over to the authorities. Really strange, unless we begin to see that a lot of what's implied, and you guys have noticed this with the covers, is that womanliness in the dominant hegemonic discourse, especially of the 50s, what was also white. I mean, there wasn't even an attempt to suggest that a Black woman could be a woman in any visible, legible way. I mean, they must be women, but unless they came into the frame as nannies, taking care of white children or something, they didn't register visually at all. And even when they did show up as nannies, they seemed to have no context, no families, no husband, no sexuality, no allure or attraction to any white people in the frame. We'll talk more about that when we look at Douglas Sirk's Imitation of Life and the novel, Nella Larson's novel, Passing. So, and the white person is certainly the superior one. And this gets back to the concept that, nobody's white in this idealistic sense, not even quote unquote white people or Caucasians. They don't even look that white. And it's all an effect of contrast. But being white is being in a position of privilege. It's not what color your skin is. That position of privilege is attached to a blank color to draw attention away from its socioeconomic standing. At the beginning, I hated her. She doesn't need food. She's one of the real saints. It's a nod toward anorexia. That trying to be, anorexia is a reverse protest against this myth of perfection. Of if I really were to do what you said to become perfectly white, I would starve myself to death. And most there are not aware of a magazine ad that says, "Want to be perfectly white? Stop eating." But they say, "So you had a cupcake? Quick ways to burn it off." You're drifting out of your ideal masquerade, out of your status as white. At the beginning, I hated her. She had no personality. She'd lay in bed with me like a dead body. And I was scared because she was shaped just the way I was. And I talk about this in my article that I put up for you on Quercus as well. The Woman is Perfected, Plath and Mademoiselle magazine. So I do have a look at that article. It's the first part of a line that's from the poem Edge, which I've also put in this packet of 5 Plath poems. The woman is perfected, her dead body wears a smile of accomplishment, where the perfect accomplishment of the masquerade of womanliness is actually coterminous with death, with not having any bodily odors, not having any pimples or scars or anything. And that's very much the case in plaster, is that this perfect woman, you cannot achieve that and still live. So, and even the cutting is a protest against this. Like, how could I be that shape? I would bleed. The cookie cutters cut, and so only she was much whiter and unbreakable and with no complaints, and that clearly is part of what's going on. Jane White seemed to have no complaints by the end of Three Faces. She gets her memories back. She marries the man that's been waiting around to marry her. Bonnie's in the back. Sticky issues like, does Bonnie's actual dad still have anything going on? Does he ever see his daughter? Is that okay with Bonnie? None of those issues, none of those post-divorce issues are cited. It's almost like he's perfectly, the second man is perfectly popped in. And the implication is that Eve White couldn't have expected a better husband than the one we see her with at the stop of this. Her performance of femininity was so poor that, of course, she wound up getting a pathetic, abusive husband. And it goes back to that cologne ad I've mentioned, that perfume ad. Want him to be more of a man, try being more of a woman. And in that final shot, she is clearly being more of a woman, as defined by patriarchal hegemonic discourse. And she has, again, by those same standards, has a better man. I don't think we know what he does for a living. So he's got a nice car. He's buying ice cream cones instead of saying, I've got a good mind to slap you. So all that seems like an improvement. So without me, she couldn't exist. So she was grateful. I gave her a soul. I bloomed out of her as a rose blooms out of a vase of not very valuable porcelain. And that introduces the issue of value here, is that now her actual self-worth is a not very valuable porcelain, even though the woman that performs is well aware that they require the sacrifice of the woman who doesn't. The world increasingly will just see the rose that is blooming, and that rose that's blooming is at the expense of the not very valuable porcelain that becomes increasingly out of the range of cultural legibility. Then I realized what she wanted was for me to love her. She began to warm up. I saw her advantages, and I backed up to the line before the rose line. And I'm skipping a little bit, and because I partly want to give you room to talk about this on Tuesday. I didn't mind her waiting on me, and she adored it. In time, our relationship grew more intense. She stopped fitting me so closely and seemed offish. I felt her criticizing me. My skin itched and flaked away in soft pieces. Now, the dominant, what we call the sustained metaphor of this poem in plaster, is the relationship of a broken leg and a cast, and a leg that has healed. So when you break your leg, so look at the implication here. To be female is to be a broken bone that needs setting. Like, that's a given. That's what you're born. You're born as a broken bone. Then the culture rushes in to set the bone with all these good intentions, Dr. Luther, Freud, all of them, so that the bone can be protected against blows while it heals. And the bone heals, but the muscle mass, as we all know, or anyone who's had a cast, atrophies. So that would be in the interior experience of being female. It atrophies because there's the point of the plaster, which is set by these male doctors, is to protect the bone, the cultural legibility, not the internal experience that's invisible inside that legibility. So that muscle is allowed to atrophy, and the implication is that after the cast is off, strictly clinical terms, you do some rehab, you walk, you get your muscle mass back. But in the context of this poem, and using this as a metaphor, there's a real lack. The self-worth has been so damaged Now, obviously, when your bone gets set, your muscle doesn't have a crisis in self-worth. But when your sense of who you are as a woman gets shored up, your sense of who you are at all atrophies. And that's much scarier. And you may not have anything like rehab to help you get back. The implication will be just be bone from now on, just be cultural legibility. You don't need to get your internal experience back online. Okay, I don't know how long this tape's probably been going too long. I could talk for days. I've been talking steadily and quickly. So not because I'm pretending I reached some all-encompassing conclusion here. But I have to stop at some point, and we'll reopen things for Tuesday. This class is a constellation and an orchestration. This is why there's no. I talk about cookie cutters. I can't cookie cut my teaching approach into slides, PowerPoint slides. My syllabus is a list of stuff we read. And interestingly, I never even submitted syllabi to anybody for 20 years. Now the university's demanding I submit my syllabi. And then the last time I did that, they sent me a 6 pages of how to make a syllabus. It's like, the hell have you been the last 20 years? I know how to make a syllabus. You just don't like it. I don't care about the syllabus. It's information. I mean, I'm happy to make it clear. It helps week to week. It's antithetical to my style of teaching, and I can't do what I do the way they want me to. So I don't want to say I'm Eve White, because I'm not that helpless. But I lately I've got the clinical gaze on me a lot as a professor, and in the way I began this tape too. And I have these centralized people telling me, this is what a syllabus is. This is what good teaching is. This isn't good teaching. You're doing this. You're not a good teacher. Wow. If I followed that, I would have a crisis in self-worth. So while not pretending that I think I'm perfect, I kind of refuse that. And I keep pointing out to them that, if all these negative things that are coming from the central command about me, why do I have 600 students in one semester? I mean, it's reality bending, because university is not like other things, especially the classes I teach. None of them are technically required for anything. So there's nothing easier than dropping my classes. And I don't really think of you guys as a captive audience. And I hope you don't think of yourself that way. There's a famous Buddhist saying that when you're ready, the teacher will arrive. And if I'm not your teacher, that could be my fault, could be your fault, who cares? The point is, I'm not your teacher. Don't make yourself stay in any context, including my class, that is antithetical to your own sense of how you need to thrive. That's a strange. I'm not saying drop my class. I'm saying don't forget. That's an easy option. You can step, if my class isn't framing you correctly, step out of the frame, get off the cover. No hard feelings. And anyway, we'll take this up some more on Tuesday. Thanks a lot for listening. Bye for now.